Welcome. We have a wonderful program for you tonight. We're happy to see you all here. Two things about the technology. If there's anyone who needs an assisted listening device, raise your hand and we'll get it to you. Also, QATV is live streaming this program when we start. And it will also be available on the library's YouTube channel if you know somebody who would like to see it, or if you'd like to see it again. All right, so we have Mr. Stephen Puleo, who's a distinguished author of 7 books, an 8th one in the making. His work has focused on Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Boston history. The books cover a variety of topics. My personal favorite is The Dark Tide, the Great Molasses Flood in the North End. But he is talking about his latest book, which is called Voyage of Mercy, which is the retelling of the history of the first humanitarian mission of food supplies for people in Ireland during the famine. So we expect it will be fascinating. I think we can't wait to get started. I will say that Mr. Puleo has appeared on C-SPAN and the History Channel and numerous local outlets. He has taught at Suffolk University, and he's now teaching at UMass Boston, where, by the way, I taught for 30 years. So I'm very pleased about that. So I want to introduce him, have him take over. He will handle how he wants to take questions and so forth. All right? So it's my very great pleasure to introduce Mr. Stephen Puleo to you.
Christy's going to mute that mic so we don't. Done?
We're going to turn it down.
Yeah. How's that? Can you guys hear me? Everything good? Thank you. Awesome. First, let me say I'm thrilled to be in Quincy. So I've already talked to a bunch of you before, so that was very exciting. This is my 632nd appearance as an author, and I think I've been in Quincy. Yeah, thanks. And I think I've been in Quincy 5 times now for 5 of my books between the Thomas Crane, and I love this library, the history of it. You guys should be really proud of this library. And the Quincy Historical Society, which is great. And one of my very early appearances, I think maybe appearance 5 or 6, definitely under 10, was at the Historical Society for Dark Tide, where we had a real great crowd. And I get lots of emails from Quincy, and I live in Weymouth, one town down, so it's almost a second hometown for me. And everybody has always been terrific. I talked to some people who have already bought books. I talked to, where's the lady from Martha's Vineyard? Where is she? Yeah. Talked to someone who's got a book club at Martha's Vineyard who wants me to come down, which I said, yeah, we'll do that. It's not bad. Not a bad appearance. So we'll definitely do that. And so it's just really nice to be here. Thank you so much. Catherine, thanks for the introduction. Also want to give kudos to Christy Lockhart, who has been my main contact on setting this up. And when you set these events up, right, there's lots of emails, right, that go back and forth, lots of organization. Christy knows this. I have lots of questions, just the way it goes. And she's been great to work with. So can we give her a round of applause? Yeah. Terrific. So the way I usually do these, and the way I'm going to do it tonight, if this works for you, is I'm going to tell the story, that story that we're going to talk about tonight, Voyage of Mercy. And I have a few things I do want to say, and then after we'll get to questions and answers. When we get to the Q&A, it happens to be my favorite part of these events. I love it. You could talk about the book, you could talk about the story, you could talk about writing, publishing, research, any of that. Really, it's a no pun intended, an open book pretty much when it comes to authors. Really, no pun intended. So feel free to do that if that works for you. Does that sound good? Great. A little bit on the just the making of the book, Voyage of Mercy. The book came out in March of 2020, 1 week before we shut down, which which is fine. Everybody's got their stories, you know. So I went into the Barnes & Noble, my home Barnes & Noble, which is Hingham, and the book had great placement, very exciting, loved it, et cetera, and then we shut down. And then when we reopened in June, late June, early July, I think the Hingham Barnes & Noble opened. And I went in there, and there's the book, and the book's in the exact same spot with like a thin layer of dust. Very surreal kind of a thing. But in any case, it worked out well. Thanks to support of people like you, the book did very well. Went into paperback on schedule in May of 2021. So the paperback's been out about a year now, which has been fabulous. So all good. If you're wondering, I saw a couple puzzled looks. I have two lav mics on tonight, two lapel mics. One is directly into the cable TV, and one is into this room. So in case you're wondering, I saw a couple people like, why is he wearing two mics? So that's what the reason is for that. So I wanted to let you know that. So Voyage of Mercy. I described this book, this story, as really kind of two polar opposites. Right? Soaring goodwill and generosity amidst what I call unfathomable despair. So the unfathomable despair on one side of the ocean is the Great Irish Famine of 1846 and 47. When I say the Great Irish Famine, it's always important to distinguish that Ireland had many famines prior to the famine. It had many famines after the famine. But the iconic famine is the Great Hunger, as the Irish call it, that starts in the summer of 1846, continues for all of 1847 into 1848, and then the famine years, as historians will call it, after that, that goes to about 1851. It's a devastating event in Ireland. Think about this, and I don't throw out a lot of numbers in my presentations because I don't use slides. I just like to talk with you. And I try to keep the numbers to a minimum, but there are a few that you should know. So prior to the Irish famine, the population of Ireland was about 9 million people. After the famine, it's just a little under 6 million people. So about a third of the country disappears. What happens to those 3 million people? About 1.3 million of them die of starvation and attendant diseases like dysentery and scurvy, typhus, things like that. And about 1.6 million, almost 1.7 million, emigrate. They leave Ireland. The great Irish migration, the great Irish diaspora, right? Many of them go to other parts of Europe. Many of them go reluctantly to England. Many of them go to Canada, but the majority of them come here to the United States. They come to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore primarily, and even many of those Irish folks who go to Canada, because they're not thrilled about staying in the empire, in the British Empire. It's cheaper to go to Canada than it is to go to New York, but once they get to Canada, they take a second boat and come down here. They are known as two-boaters, right? I see a lot of people. Anybody of Irish heritage here? Yeah, I get that a lot on the South Shore. But sure, lots of Irish have that two-boater in their ancestry. So the famine is one of those events in Irish history that laid the foundation, probably for most important Irish events in history for the next 150 years. At least, I would say, till the turn of this century, maybe a little bit even into this century, right? It's kind of a foundational event, if you think about it. It's the famine and its aftermath that lays the foundation for Irish independence in the early 1920s, that lays the foundation for the Irish remaining neutral and actually sympathetic to the Nazis during the Second World War. Talk a little bit about that. And really that lays the foundation for the Troubles in the 1970s and the 80s and the 90s. So there's all kinds of reasons for those things, but when you dig in, when you go through the documents, when you go through the research, the famine always comes back as the foundation. One Irish historian said in 1999 that the famine has been the unseen guest at every single Irish dinner table for 150 years. And I think that's true. I think that's true. We're at the 175th anniversary this year of the 1847 disaster in Ireland. And so think about this. This is also a time during this great potato blight failure due to a fungus. This is a time when about 30% of the Irish population relies exclusively on the potato, almost 100% on the potato for food and as a cash crop. So if you have an abundant, luxuriant harvest, potato harvest, you can eat as a family, and then you can sell the other potatoes you have and buy a mule, buy a pig, buy a cart, buy anything like that. Very, very important. So when the Irish have a good potato crop, not only is it good for their health, their economic well-being, their vitality, it's also good for their psyche. It's also good for the psyche. I won't say there was any outright happiness throughout Ireland during this period, but a good potato crop meant contentment. A poor potato crop portended disaster, as what happens in this famine, but also brings the Irish to the brink of despair because they know how reliant they are on it. Sir Charles Trevelyan, who's the British bureaucrat who was responsible for handling the famine and does a very poor job, we'll talk about that, once said, "What hope is there for a nation which relies on potatoes?" And of course, the Irish viewed the potatoes as very, very vital to their health. What Trevelyan doesn't say is that one of the reasons the Irish rely so much on the potato is because almost none of the Irish tenant farmers that worked the land own the land. They worked the land on behalf of absentee British landlords at the time. And through the years leading up to the famine, the slices of land that the Irish worked grew narrower and narrower, smaller and smaller. And the one crop that provided enough yield to feed a large family, and the Irish birth rate was increasing prior to the famine, was the potato. It provided the minerals, the calories, other nutrients, vitamins, all of that. It was easy to digest, so the potato has so much value in that case. Why did the tenant farmers have these small plots of land? Because the absentee British landlords had been engaging in, I would say, anti-Catholic behavior, all the way back to the penal laws of 1695. No question, it doesn't start with the famine. It goes back to William of Orange, but it really gets worse leading into the famine years and really kind of crystallizes during 1846 and 1847. So in the summer of 1846, to give you an indication of how fast things happen, the summer of 1846, around mid-August, is when the Irish potato crop fails, turns black. First in Cork County, and then throughout the rest of the country, turns black. By about October or November, so 3 months or so, starvation is underway. Starvation is underway. And then things get really, really bad during December of 46, January of 47. It's one of the worst winters in Irish history. Howling winds, heavy snow, ice, all of it. Terrible, terrible winter. And during that period of time, because these Irish can no longer pay their rent, they are evicted by their British landlords by the thousands. Not everyone. There are some benevolent British landlords, as there always are in these kinds of situations. But by the thousands, they're evicted. The word eviction is very profound in Irish history. Not only in Ireland, but once the Irish come, let's say, to the United States. When they come, what's the first thing they do? The Irish want to own homes here. They want to buy their own home because you can't be evicted. But in Ireland during this time, they were evicted by the thousands. Many of these folks were literally wandering the roadways during the winters, starving. Sometimes their homes torn down around them. And when I say homes, I mean hovels, I mean mud huts, right? I mean cabins, those kinds of things. The British are really unmerciful in the way they do this. And eviction stays with the Irish for a long time after that, this phrase, eviction. The famine does many, many things in terms of the relationship between the Irish and the British, and the Irish and the United States. First, the British. The British handled this very, very poorly. Now, I've been asked at many of these events, you know, there's a group of Irish historians from about the 1950s to the 1980s who say, was this a genocide? Was this a genocide, the way the British handled it? And I don't fall into that category, and I think most Irish historians no longer do since about 1980. You know, the historiography of events changes, you guys know that. But I mean, if you use the textbook definition of a genocide, remember that word's actually invented in 1948 by the United Nations to describe the Holocaust, which is a state-sponsored extermination or attempted extermination of a people based on their race or religion. Essentially, that's the textbook definition of it. And so I would say it doesn't fall into that category, but I will say the way the British handled this was incompetent, inept, with impotence, anti-Catholicism, just in a terrible, terrible way, slow to move. And remember, Ireland is part of England during this time. They're part of England. But the British do very, very little, and when they finally do something, when they finally open up soup kitchens in Ireland, April of 1847 into May of 47, a good 6 months into the starvation, it's too late. Too little, too late. The British don't want to disrupt their corn markets, as they're called, their exports. Very, very important there that they want to kind of keep things moving from an economic standpoint. They have a very laissez-faire attitude towards the way they want to handle their economy. And of course, they have this real burning anti-Catholicism towards the Irish in this period of time. So one of the things that seared into the memory of the Irish people during the famine, right? When you have these events, you know, you can quote statistics, you can read about it, but one of the images that kind of gets passed down, I would say not only in the history, but in the folklore of the Irish famine, right, is there were times in this winter when men, women, and children starving along the roadways would see a cart filled with other kinds of grains, guarded by British troops, on their way to ports to be exported out of Ireland. So there is food that gets exported to a great extent in the midst of this starvation. That's what's happening during this time. It is not a good scene. The British have a lot to, in this period of time, had a lot to answer for. They've talked about this, the British, over the years. I think there's kind of even a reckoning in Britain on the way that this was handled. But it does, as I said, affect Irish-British relations all the way up to the turn of the century, a little bit all the way, I think, till now. The thing I use is this World War II piece, which is fascinating to me. Like, I think it's worth a book on its own. I'm not doing it, but I'm just saying. I don't want you to think that's the topic of the next book. But this World War II thing is fascinating to me. So even when Winston Churchill, Britain is standing alone in 1940 and the first half of 41, and Winston Churchill reaches out to the Irish and says, you know, can you join us in our efforts against the Axis? The De Valera government says, no, not interested because of that issue that has been there since the famine. Irish troops finally, in some cases, defect from Ireland because they want to fight on the side of the British. They're basically called traitors. They're prosecuted if they're caught. They are not fully pardoned. These members of the Irish Defence Force are not fully pardoned until 2012, 10 years ago. Just to tell you about the long-term effects of this thing. 10 years ago, they finally get pardoned. It becomes a really huge issue for many ordinary Irishmen after December 7th, 1941, when the United States enters the war, right? It's no longer just Britain's war. It's no longer the hated British on whose side we will be. Now it's the Americans. And the Irish relationship with the United States is a very fond one, a very strong one, in large part because of this mission, this story, and continues really up to this day. So that whole World War II thing is fascinating. Keep this in mind. There's about 7 countries during the Second World War that are, quote, neutral. You know, Switzerland, Spain, Yemen. Ireland's one of them. Ireland's one of them. And again, you had tension, not just between Irish and British, but tension between the Irish government and ordinary Irishmen who, again, after the United States gets into the war, want to go on the side of the United States. But that's just one of those byproducts of the famine. And I think is so fascinating. That's the underlying reason for it. Other side of the ocean. We're moving to the United States. Welcome. Other side of the ocean. The US response to this is extraordinary, unprecedented. Just an amazing, as I was going through the research, just amazing to see during this period. So, at first, there's a little skepticism in the United States. Some of the Irish parishes, the Catholic parishes in the Boston area, in New York, sometime around October, November of '46, ask their parishioners to contribute. There's a little bit of boy who cried wolf mentality because the Irish had faced, these mini famines before, and the people in the United States, even Catholic parishioners, are wondering, well, how bad can this possibly be? So there's a little reluctance. But in January, around January 20th of 1847, the first couple of ships arrive in Boston and arrive in New York from Ireland. And word goes around quickly about how bad things are in the country, how the starvation is. Children especially really affects everybody. Ultimately, there's about 500,000 children that starve in Ireland during this period. But the word is going out. So very, very quickly, and this happened in a snap, very, very quickly, in Boston, the Boston city leaders hold a meeting at Faneuil Hall. Several hundred leaders in Boston hold a meeting. And a ship captain, an experienced sailor by the name of Robert Bennett Forbes, one of the main characters in this book, we'll talk a little bit about him, puts forth an idea that basically says this: how about we petition our congressman to put a bill in front of Congress that allows the conversion of 2 warships. We retrofit those warships, we take the guns off, we collect food in Boston and New York, 2 big cities, 2 important kind of cities, and we send that food to Ireland. The Boston people do that. The Boston congressman petitions Congress very quickly, and in February of 1847, Congress is debating this issue. They very quickly vote to turn these 2 warships over to private captains, Forbes and a captain in New York City. First time it's ever happened that they decide to decommission 2 warships and make them ships of mercy, if you will, to go to Ireland. They also are debating in the floors of Congress, contributing about $500,000 in cash to Ireland, that this may be helpful. President Polk gets word to Congress and says, if you put that bill in front of my desk, I am going to veto it, because I think it's unconstitutional to give American money to another country. Number one. Number two, not really politically expedient for us to do this. Why? History has these weird connections. Here's the why. We're in negotiation with the British for Oregon territory. We want Oregon territory, right? That's smack dab in the middle of these. This could be a real problem. So number one, I think it's unconstitutional. Number two, I don't think it's a politically good move to do. So Congress kind of huddles again. Polk does too. And Congress then decides to adopt a very advisory role. Some of the big senators, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts at the time, set up this committee that basically encourages, endorses, asks every town, city in the United States of America to set up a committee for the relief of Ireland. And lo and behold, almost every single jurisdiction does. Big cities do. Boston, again, Boston, New York, Baltimore, Philly, right down the coast. Towns do. Small towns along the Mississippi, like Steubenville, Ohio, along the Ohio. But towns and frontier outposts along the Mississippi. The rural area known as Detroit at the time, yes, does it. All the way west to Wisconsin. Each and every one of these communities sets up this committee. And their goal, as often as they can, is to send not money to Ireland, even though some do, but to send direct food aid. There's a feeling that direct food will get to people quicker, and it will. And so what do? Food that they're growing and harvesting normally for their own families. They put into burlap sacks, they dried it, they cured it, they salted it, all of that, put it into kegs, put it on small boats that went along the Ohio River and the Erie Canal to the big port cities and shipped it to Ireland. The Boston ship that gets decommissioned is the USS Jamestown. On March 28th, 1847, remember that meeting in Faneuil Hall in February. On March 28th, 1847, the USS Jamestown departs for Ireland with food, laden with food. It is the first of 150 ships that would leave the United States for Ireland over the next 16 months, till about July 4th of 1848. It is a remarkable effort. It has never happened before. Think about this. Why don't you think about this, right? This is a period of time when nations went to war with each other. You know, they pillaged each other's villages, they burned their crops, they burned their cities. Sometimes they traded with each other, no question, when it was economically, appropriate. But this notion of the people, especially, of one nation, helping the people of another nation on such a broad scale, there were little individual pockets from time to time, but on such a massive scale, unprecedented. Had never happened before. People ask me, when I talk about this book, why? Like, what prompted the United States, the people of the United States, to do this? Where did it come from, this window in which they gave so much? I mean, think about this. When you guys do charity, when you contribute to charity, what do? You write a check, you go online, you make a contribution with your credit card, maybe you bring food down to the food pantry. All very generous things to do, for sure. What prompted these people to literally take food out of the mouths of their own family and send it to people they'd never met before in Ireland? So when you kind of write history and research history, you put a lot of things together, and I think really there are several things that came together, converged together to create this perfect moment for the United States to make these contributions. Number one, in the Northeast, among progressives in the Northeast, there is a great deal of what I call progressive guilt about the Mexican War and the recent annexation of Texas, right? Most progressives in the Northeast view the annexation of Texas as kind of an extension of slavery, a move to extend slavery, sort of right for the most part. And there's a feeling that this is something that we can do to atone for it. To atone for it. That's one. Number two, we're in the midst right now of the second great American reawakening, right? 100 years or so after the first. Led by mostly the Protestant churches, although there's other denominations that come in. And there's a feeling in this second great awakening that we need to do something to help our fellow man, more to help our fellow man, that ordinary people can do more to help their fellow men. And so that's happening. 3, we're in the midst right here, 1846, 1847, 1848, of all of these reform movements, prison reform, education reform, mental health reform, the abolitionist movement just getting its legs under it here at this time. You know, it doesn't really develop till later in the 1850s, but getting its legs under it. The women's suffrage movement just in the early years. All of that is coming together. And I think there's that feeling that why can't we extend this benevolent activity overseas as well? So I think that's part of it. And the last part, and I think maybe one of the most important parts, 1846 is the year of what's known, remember your high school history, manifest destiny, right? Remember that term? Yes. This woman's rolling her eyes like, okay. Yes, but you remember that term, right? So manifest destiny. Now, manifest destiny basically was used for the first time in 1846. It's this notion where people were picking up their stakes east and moving west. And manifest destiny gets a lot of bad press for good reasons, for some good reasons. But I think there's a noble virtue in manifest destiny that says something like this. We live in a country with acres and acres of arable land, with miles and miles of navigable rivers, and with many, many ocean ports that are teeming with fish. We have an obligation. We have an obligation to share some of that abundance with others. And so I think that's part of this. So I think all of those four elements come together, and it leads to this outpouring of generosity, soaring goodwill, no question about it, on behalf of the American people to the Irish. Two main characters I wanted to talk to you about in this book. I think it's worth mentioning them both before we get to questions, because the effort is so extraordinary and both of these men are so extraordinary. Robert Bennett Forbes on the American side, as I said, very well-known ship captain. He probably logged more miles at sea than any other person of his era or most eras. He talks himself about between his ages of 17 and 27, he was on firm, dry land for about 6 months, in that decade, for about 6 months. Now, you think of this person, Robert Bennett Forbes, with a name like that, the first thing you're thinking about is, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's a Boston Brahmin from old money, et cetera, et cetera. I can see your mind. Yes, this woman's nodding. Yeah, I can see your mind working. But I'll tell you, nothing is really further from the truth. Robert Bennett Forbes is one of these extraordinary, literal self-made men. He takes his first transatlantic voyage at the age of 6, when his mother takes him and his brother across the ocean, harrowing voyage across the ocean to chase their ne'er-do-well father, who was kind of run from the family with the excuse that he wants to make some money. They go after him. At 13, he's a cabin boy on a ship to China. At 20, he commands a vessel to China, both in the mercantile trade and in the opium trade, which is legal at that point. He becomes a millionaire by the time he's 30, loses it all in the Panic of 1837, is destitute, and gets it all back by the time he's 40. Really one of these swashbuckling guys that Hollywood could make a movie about, no question about it. No question about it. He and his wife Rose, they're married in 1834. They lose 2 children very quickly, back to back. They finally have a child that lives. He's 8 months old in late 1838 when Robert Bennett Forbes, they're broke at this point, Robert Bennett Forbes says, I'm going to China because I need to make money. I'm going to regain our competence. That's the phrase. And he leaves for China for 2 years. And there's this extraordinary exchange of letters between Robert Bennett Forbes and Rose that I just loved as I was doing the research. about the kind of strain it put on the marriage. Yes, Rose is very, very depressed, almost has a nervous breakdown back here with their 8-month-old, and still broke for the most part. But I think their marriage actually becomes strengthened in some ways with these letters, this communication back and forth, and they share very intimate details. And it's really interesting, you know, today we would maybe text back and forth, whatever, but in this time it took 4 to 5 months for these letters to pass. So Robert Bennett Forbes says to his wife, and just kind of emphasizes, please number and date your letters. So I know what I'm responding to, so I know what you heard, what you did, so we can keep track of everything that's going on. Really, this great cache of letters. Forbes comes home, gets home safely with money in 1840. And Rose pretty much says, okay, you're staying home for a while. We're going to raise a family. They do. They have 3 children until this 1847 meeting when Robert Bennett Forbes says, I will volunteer to command the Jamestown. I will lead this mission to Ireland. And when his wife says, why are you going away again? Forbes says this, it is not an everyday matter to see a nation starving. I need to do this. And he does. And he does. Now, he has to assemble a crew for this Jamestown mission. Many of the most talented, experienced sailors and seamen are at war at the Battle of Veracruz in the Mexican War, right there. They're doing their thing. So he's able to get a few experienced officers to help him, but then he puts together this ragtag group of sailors, who many of whom have no experience. So he puts an ad in the paper, basically, looking for people to do this mission. He gets tons of letters. I read all of them. And they're often these letters from people who say, I am a cook, I have no experience at sea. I am an accountant, I have no experience at sea. I am a saloon keeper with no experience at sea. Often, over and over again, he puts together this ragtag bunch, trains them in a matter of a couple of weeks, along with his officers. He's got experienced officers. And then they depart on March 28th. It takes them 3 weeks to get to Ireland. The first couple of weeks, 9 days, 10 days, first 10 days, let's call it. Stormy, winter, ice on the riggings, the whole 9 yards. And he keeps that ship moving and he keeps that crew doing what they need to do. And they arrive in Ireland. When you see the cover of the book later, if you haven't seen it, they arrive in Ireland at County Cork, the most hard-hit county by the famine, and the place where the Boston Committee has designated its supplies to go to. He arrives there. The people know he's coming. There's been newspaper articles that Forbes is on the way, that Jamestown is on the way. When he gets there are blazing bonfires on the hillside. There are candles lit in the cabins. It's just kind of a mystical experience, a mystical arrival in County Cork. And when he gets there, he meets the other main character in this book on the Irish side, Father Theobald Matthew. Father Matthew, known as the people's priest among the poor parishioners of Cork City. In the 1830s, Father Matthew was side by side with Irish peasants during a cholera epidemic, working with them in the fever sheds. Just that kind of a priest. Rolled up his sleeve. He was respectful to poverty, was one of the descriptions by one of his biographers. He would have confession at 5 a.m. or 11 p.m. because most of his parishioners worked in the fields and couldn't get there any other time. He learned Gaelic because the people in the countryside who would sometimes come into Cork City didn't know English. So he learned Gaelic. He becomes world famous in the 1830s, world famous without leaving Ireland, for getting hundreds of thousands of Irish people to sign a temperance pledge, an anti-drinking pledge. Don't be snickering. Don't be this lady's like it didn't work. No, don't do that. But seriously, hundreds of thousands of Irish sign this anti-drinking pledge. He becomes known as the Apostle of Temperance. That's what his nickname is. And literally becomes world-renowned. By the way, after all of this famine, he comes to the United States, and thousands of Irish here do the same thing. But during the famine, Father Matthew is again in the trenches with people who are starving, sick, and dying. He gives food to people when he can. He gives money to people when he can. He allows poor Irish to sleep in his home when he can. He's in the fever sheds again, working with them day and night. And he builds a Catholic cemetery at his parish to bury the dead. He is again an extraordinary figure. And he takes on the role of being the main communicator with the British, begging for help. He writes to Sir Charles Trevelyan in London. The food of a whole nation has perished. Distress is everywhere. And so letter after letter he sends to Parliament, he sends a letter to the Queen at that time, in his efforts. And so when Forbes and Father Matthew meet, and they finally meet in Cork, when Matthew boards the Jamestown after it docks, and they shake hands. It's a huge moment for the Irish. Two saviors, they say. The savior they know, Father Matthew, the savior from across the sea, Robert Bennett Forbes. It's quite a meeting. And together, Forbes and Matthew set up a little committee in Cork, and they just figure out how they're going to distribute the food across the county. Really very cool moment. And like I said, the first of 150 ships that would come to various ports in Ireland to drop off food. One other point, then I want to get to your questions. So lots of times you'll read statistics or hear reports that say something like this. The people of the United States does not give as much international humanitarian aid as other countries on a per capita basis. You hear that often. And I will say this, the Jamestown Mission sets up the model, the public-private partnership model for United States charitable giving on an international basis and even a domestic basis that we use today. So whereas in 1847, Congress was involved in a small way, and the American people in a big way, and that percentage varies over the years, but the model stays exactly the same. Case in point. The last figures available for dollars contributed in humanitarian aid, this is not to be confused with defense spending to other countries, but in humanitarian aid, 2019, the United States gave $120 billion $120 billion in international aid. 50 billion of that came from the United States government. That is to say, your tax dollars, by the way. But the other 70 billion comes from you, not just you, comes from you in this private model. When you contribute to the United Way, when you contribute to Catholic Charities or Combined Jewish Philanthropies or any other NGO or your workplace, it's a private model. And we still use that today. We have used it in catastrophic circumstances. The explosion in Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1917, right? Yeah, there's a government response, but it's mostly the people of Boston who make the contributions. The Berlin airlift in 1948, right? Berlin is surrounded by the Soviets. Yeah, the Air Force is part of the planes that allow food to be dropped, but the food that's contributed is almost all privately contributed. The Chilean miners, remember them trapped in 2010? Yeah, there's a government response to some extent, but it's American equipment, private technological equipment that was used to get those miners out. That's how that model works. We have always done it that way. So that when you hear those statistics or those reports that say the American people aren't as generous, or America is not as generous as other countries, know this: those statistics almost always are based on government contributions. Government contributions. Other countries do not have this kind of a model. That's not to say there's not private contributions in other countries. But the fact that if you take that 120 and 70 is private and 50 is government, that doesn't happen in other countries. So know this, people in Quincy. You're a generous group of people. You should know that. And the United States and the people of the United States are continuing to be a very, very generous people. So thank you very much. And let's get to questions. I'm ready. Thank you so much. I need a sip of water, if you don't mind. Now, when we do these questions, guys, I will repeat the question. So you don't have to strain. As long as I can hear it, we'll do that. So who would like to be first? I know this is not a shy group, a lot of nodding, a lot of this. Who would like to be first? Guys? Yeah? Yes?
May as well be me.
Yeah, why not?
Can you address the famine or the blight, the potato blight that still exists in Ireland today?
So can I address the blight that still exists in Ireland today?
They still have that.
Yeah,
infection.
they do. They have it. Although I will say this, so the blight that hits in I can say this, the blight that hits in 1847 is almost, it's so severe that it's almost a complete mystery to them. It damages not just the roots, if you will, but the shoots of the plant is I think how you describe it, so that wind could actually blow the blight onto the shoots. And it was a very kind of mysterious thing that almost nobody knew. So Ireland still has blights of some kind, but I think number one, not as severe. There's more knowledge, there's more science knowledge that wasn't available then. And even though, there's a cliche, the Irish do not rely so much on the potato anymore. They use it a lot, but they don't rely on it so much. It's hard to get this notion of 30% of a population that relies exclusively on the potato into your head. Into my head too. I don't mean your head, but I mean anyone's head. But you don't have that quite as much anymore. So you don't really hear famine. You'll hear shortages. You'll hear, a little crisis. We're about to face some shortages in wheat, for example. Things like that. You will still hear that in Ireland. But you don't have that kind of widespread devastation. This was countrywide, devastating kind of famine. Yeah, it's great. What else? Yeah, Kath.
What did the British attitude, what was the British attitude to these ships coming in?
Yeah, great question. What was the British attitude to the ships coming in? I will say for the most part, hands off. There was not this Oregon Territory proceeds, we have the state of Oregon now, that's why. So those negotiations go fine. I think the British, a couple things are in play. The British, number one, know that it's not a government effort. It's not the official stance of the United States government. It's all these private folks that are part of this contribution. That's number one that's at play. And number two, the British, I think, once these ships start to arrive, are a little bit embarrassed about their own callousness. And so you do not get this sort of outrage or anything like that on the British side, either from Parliament or from the Crown. The Queen is very, the Queen does not come out looking great in this. She does this perfunctory letter, please help the Irish, a little bit too late. And Parliament, for the most part, stays relatively quiet too during this. So that's sort of I would say, kind of the laissez-faire attitude that they have to their own economic markets. Same thing when the United States, when food was arriving from the United States. Yeah. Yes, I see you. Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your research process that you went through and.
Yeah, of course. The research process. Yeah, always a good part when you write nonfiction, right? So nonfiction gets broken up into two parts for me, the research and the writing. Research, nonfiction authors handle this different ways, right? So I tend to like to have almost all of my research done before I start the writing. So there's other authors that do it a different way. I like to kind of gather the research, with love, like this. So here's all the stuff I have, because I like to know what I have when I'm going to start my writing. Why? Because, thankfully, I can't reach that wood over there to knock on it. But if I were to knock on wood, I would say I usually don't experience writer's block. But if there's the occasional moment when I'm like, how am I going to start this scene? How am I going to start this chapter? I'll say, oh yeah, I remember this letter that Rose wrote to Robert Bennett Forbes, talking about that. So maybe there's a way to start. So that's why I like to have my research with me. Now, it's not to say that if I come across a great document during the writing, I won't use it, because I will. If there's a eureka moment somewhere, oh. But at some point, here's the thing, you have to stop researching and get to writing. You could always find another document. That's easy to do. So I have to back up. Here's what I do. Here's when your manuscript's due. Here's how long I know it's going to take me to write my manuscript. So here's where the research stops. Under contract, you have to do that. And I think that's a good thing, because I might have a tendency to do too much research, to be honest with you. Does that answer your question when you say the process, or did you have another thing in mind? I just want to make sure I answered you.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I was also interested in where you found all the documents.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, thank you. That's good. So Robert Bennett Forbes, here's the thing I loved about Forbes. He's a prolific writer. Not only is he a doer, but he's a prolific writer, which doesn't always happen in history, So he writes hundreds of letters. He keeps logbooks. This exchange with Rose is phenomenal. Diaries, he keeps diaries. He writes an autobiography, and when I say that, most people who write autobiographies write them, 30 years into the future. And so there's always this tendency to what? Embellish. When you're writing here about an event here, you're like, I'm the greatest thing ever. I remember that, right? So Forbes didn't do that. Forbes wrote his autobiography kind of in the moment, if you know what I'm saying. So he writes about the Jamestown in 1847. So that's the best source you can get if you're a historian, is as close to the event that it happens. Forbes does that. All those papers are at the Mass Historical Society. For all of Forbes' papers. Have anyone been to the Robert Bennett Forbes house in Milton? Yeah, worth going if you guys have an opportunity. It's the house that he built for his mother before he gets married. And before he goes broke. By the way, yes, builds that house. And so that's there. A lot of the famines, I'll stay in this side of the ocean. The contributions from these different towns and communities across America, most of that is organized by the Quakers, the organization. And so there are hundreds of letters from these communities to the Quakers' headquarters in New York City that says, the town of Steubenville is proud to send, 1,800 barrels of, rye, wheat, dried pork, and dried venison, to the residents of Galway. So there's these great letters that are part of that. And on the famine side, a lot of the famine stuff is digitized now. So the Parliament has records. The Devon Commission, which is the big commission that the British set up to look at the Irish famine, almost all their records are digitized. The Crown has stuff online about the famine. So And there's tons of secondary. I use a lot of primary sources. When you read my bibliographic essay, which you are required to do if you buy the book, when you read my bibliographic essay, you'll see the kind of primary sources I use. But there are great secondary sources on the famine too. So you piece that together and you write a story. So for me, it's all about the story when I write. So the story, the drama, the second part of that word history is story, right? So a lot of people, I think, forget that when they teach history, when they write history. So my story, I like to think, pulls the big history along. So I want you are learning the big history. Here's my hope when I'm writing. You are learning the big history almost in spite of yourself because you're enjoying the story so much. Like, that's my goal. If you're sitting down and saying, what is your goal as an author? That's my goal for you, is to read those 3 or 4 or 5 pages before you go to bed at night. My book on your nightstand. This is what I'm envisioning. My book on your nightstand. You read 3 or 4 or 5 pages before you go to bed, and you're saying, wow, I love this story. And then you wake up the next morning and you say, oh yeah, that's right. The Irish were kind of supportive of the Nazis during World War II, like that. That's what I'm trying to do. So that's my process. I know it's a long answer, but I get very excited about these things, you know. Yes, sir.
I've heard that I know England downplayed the horror of the hunger of the Irish, and then when Captain Forbes came back to the States, he put in the media and how the whole country responded to that.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. So when Forbes comes back, he actually writes, I want to say it's about 70 pages, a summation of his mission, and does talk about how bad conditions are in Cork, and that he doesn't really get outside of Cork, but he hears enough from other counties. Matter of fact, when he gets there, he hears from pastors in other counties that say, hey, can we have some of that food that you have? But he stands firm on that and says, no, the people of Boston and New England, it's actually called NECRIS, the New England Committee for the Relief of Ireland and Scotland, because there's Scottish partial famine in Scotland too. The NECRIS committee has designated that all of the Jamestown food is going to Cork. So he stands firm on that. And then those other ships that follow go to many of the other counties. Yeah.
Another thing too, I want to mention, about England.
Yeah.
How they told Ireland, I don't know how true this is, how they told Ireland to fish, but yet we were too weak to pull in our catch.
Yeah, you are, that is true. You are correct. So, yeah, I'm going to repeat. Give me 1 second. Yes. So the British told the Irish, why don't you fish? Which is a kind of a logical thing when you look at where Ireland is on a map, right? But a couple things were going on. Number one, the Irish at that point were very weak, so that's one. But I think the two main things that had happened is, prior to that, during some of those mini famines, some of the Irish did try to fish. Fishing is very difficult off the coast of Ireland. Extremely difficult, very hard to do. Have to be extremely skilled to do it. Two, lots of Irish, as the famine hit, sold some of the ships they had for cash because they had no cash crop. So I think all that comes into play. But Ireland is one of the most difficult countries in the world to fish off of, from what I understand and from what I've read. So I think all those factors came into play, that fishing really wasn't an option, despite the fact that here you are surrounded by water, you know? Yeah.
Thank you.
So, yeah, you're very welcome. What else? I saw another. Okay. We'll go here first, yeah, because the front row sometimes gets ignored because I try to work from the back up. Yeah.
Forbes personally made only the one voyage?
Yes, Forbes did make only the one voyage, but I'll tell you this, and I talk about this in the book too, he's a real hero. Later, after this, I think it's 1849, he's on another quick trip to England when his ship collides with another ship. He's not the captain, he's a passenger. His ship collides with another ship. Forbes jumps in the water attempting to rescue people who went into the water. Like, he's a hero. You look, when you're a historian, you want to be, naturally skeptical, I'd say, and try to build this character as properly as you can. But the guy's quite a guy. So, yeah, another great question. Yeah. Wait, did you already ask me a question? You did. Let me go to someone who hasn't asked me, and then I'll come back to you. Is that okay? Yes, sir. Yes.
Robert Bennett Forbes had a Quincy connection too.
Yes.
Later on, he was the founder of Sailor's Dock Harbor in Germantown,
Oh, I did not know that.
which was a,
He's the founder of what?
of Sailor's Dock Harbor in Germantown.
Oh, okay.
Which, it still exists, so it isn't in Germantown anymore.
Yeah.
But it does, it gives a charitable cause. But he was the president of the foundation that started Sailor's Dock Harbor in Germantown. The buildings are still there in
I
Germantown.
did not know that. I knew Forbes was very active in the Coast Guard, like the precursor to the Coast Guard, and did a lot on naval ship safety, sailing safety. He was very, very involved in that. But I didn't know that. So,
Yeah, sailors are merchant sailors.
yep,
That
merchant
in their old
sailors. Yep.
age had somewhere to live.
Ah,
And it was a home, and they had a farm in Germany.
I did not know that. Awesome. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
I was curious, because it took me by surprise when you were talking about that Ireland had so this is my interpretation, a dual economy, the local potato economy that the Irish subsisted on. And the British had a larger economy that was more, I'm going to just say international because it left Ireland. So that continued while the potato famine is going on. The British are farming up lands that they own.
So, I don't know if you guys heard that, but let me sum it up. And I think you said it really well, by the way. So the Irish peasants have their potato economy, and the British have a little bit of a bigger economy that maybe includes the potato, but also has international aspects to it. And you incredulously asked, are you saying that they exported food from Ireland in the midst of this famine? The answer is yes. Yes, that is correct. You are right. That's part of, there's lots of Irish that say they don't refuse to call it a famine because of that. They call it the Great Hunger, right? That's what it's called. Specifically, there are a lot of Irish historians, like I said, especially in that 1950 to 1980 period, who were talking about it as a genocide, that said, you can't say it's a famine when food's being exported. It's the Great Hunger. So yes, you are correct. Yeah. Oh, follow up, sorry.
Yes, it is,
Yeah.
because, so it sounds, so this is again, I don't, the lands, if it sounds like, what did you say, like 3 million people either die or leave the
Or
country.
leave, yeah.
So what, their lands, even though they were small tenant farmers, does that land, so did the British get to gather up all those small farms again?
Yeah, so did the British gather up all those small farms again once the Irish left them? Yes, yes, these are owned by British. So as I said to you earlier, there are there are some benevolent absentee British landlords who forgive rent, who try to donate to the Irish families, that sort of thing. But they're very, very small in number. That property is owned by them, and most British landlords evict, foreclose on, use whatever term you want, on the Irish when they can no longer pay their rent. Yeah. I know.
So who then works their land?
So their land then, so their land doesn't get worked for a long period of time. Who works their land? The land doesn't get worked for a long period of time. There are British landlords who lost a ton of money during this famine. Yes, if that's your question you're getting at. They don't get worked until later, much post-famine. Yeah, that happens often. There are British landlords who go broke as a result of the Irish famine. So they'll evict when they can't pay, but then nobody is there to work the land. You're right. You're correct. Yeah.
You mentioned how this is a foundational event, the
Yeah,
hunger, and
I think so.
It's 1847 and Irish independence was, what, 1921?
Hmm.
Do you make a strong connection there, or is it just like institutional memory of
Yeah,
we won out?
yes, so there's the big famine in 1847. There's a pretty good sized famine in 1879 and 80, which is often flies under the radar screen, where the United States, by the way, retrofitted another warship, the USS Constellation, kind of the same model they used in 47, in 1879 and 1880. And so I think that connection sort of gets you into the later part of the 19th century and then into the early part of the 20th century. But yeah, in that Irish independence movement, Collins and those guys, there's lots of talk about the famine. I mean, here's the thing about the famine, right? Were there bigger famines numerically in the 20th century in Russia and China and Africa? Of course. But this percentage of people, I use this thing that 1/3 of the population disappears, right? This percentage of people really doesn't have that kind of historical, cachet, folklore. There's tremendous folklore in the famine. Poems get written about it, songs get written about it. So yeah, it's all part of that, I think. Yeah, great question.
Is there any connection to why Northern Ireland didn't get involved in the independence?
Well,
did they not have the famine, or?
No, they had it, but not as bad. Most of the famine is in the South. And of course, it's mostly more Protestant up there, right? It always has been. And so there's that separation that you have. You know, when I talk about this kind of lingering effect of the famine, that I say it maybe starts to change in the first decade of this century. But I will tell you, in 2009, we went to Ireland, my wife and I and members of her family go to Ireland, and we rent one of those big vans with the windows and the glass ceilings and all that. And we started in the south, do some of the stuff in the south, and then go up north to Belfast and George's Causeway. Is that what you call it? Yeah. George's, yes? Giant's Causeway. Thank you, George. Giant's Causeway. And so we do all that. But one night we're in the north in a hotel. We come out the next morning, and our driver's side window is shattered. So our tour guide, driver, got it. You know, he's furious. He said, I know what happened. They saw the Southern license plates. So that's 2009. Like, you know, it's anecdotal, right? But, and like I said, those Irish defense guys are not pardoned until 2012. So there's this, I think that's lingers, you know? Yeah. Yeah. Excuse me. Christy, are you giving me the high sign?
No, scratching my head.
Oh, okay. I thought Christy might have been giving me the hook, so I needed to find out. I need to do my famous, only one more question. No, that's fine. Go ahead, yes.
Well, the question is, over the 20th century, language changed for, let's say, shell shock, to battle fatigue, to post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
So I think what you're talking about is like a massive PTSD for a nation. Was there any kind of folk language to describe that, or was it just simply a great despair?
Yeah, is there any kind of folk language? I don't really see that. I see like time, you know, intermarriage, you know, I see generational things change, you know, that over time. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that as late as 2000, this was still such an important thing. You know, it's 150 years more. And so that's even extraordinary to me. But I think, you know, I think we're at this point now where maybe at least I don't hear it, see it, read about it. There's that kind of rancor between the British and the Irish. I'll say it that way, right? I think we might be past it. Are we past it?
No.
No. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. That shows how much I know. No. Maybe I'm just too hopeful. We're not past it. All right. Awesome. But yeah, what can I tell you? Yeah. Wait. Did you already ask me a question?
No.
Okay. Yes. What can I?
Well, I have two things. First of all,
Sure.
I left a 70-year-old husband at home with potatoes for dinner, and although he is not doesn't consider himself really Irish because he's 100%, he will be the first one to say, well, I'm Irish, give me those potatoes, I need more, give me more butter. I think it's genetic, I really do.
Well, listen, I married into a large Irish family. I'm not gonna say that we only had potatoes, but I am gonna say that, you know, yeah. Wait, let me say it this way. My wife is a fantastic cook, despite her heritage. So what I mean by that is, God rest her soul, my mother-in-law was not a great cook. So I don't know. My wife is just gifted in so many ways, but I don't know where that came from. Is that diplomatic enough for you?
I have a practical question though.
Yeah.
And I'm a really practical person. I know the 4 things that you said that
Well,
brought America to the point.
I'm saying to you, those are my 4 things.
Right.
Like there's no document that says here are the 4 things that came together. I just want to be clear about that.
Right.
Okay.
But they're very ethereal and psychological.
Yeah, I
I'm
think
thinking
so.
more like every parish had somebody who spread the word, or that was the time when the newspapers, all of a sudden, they were costing a penny and everyone got them. There's gotta be a way that message
Yes.
permeates
Yes.
in a big way.
Yes, and so the message permeates along the East Coast and some of the cities in the East Coast. You'll recall that the telegraph is invented in 1844, which you knew. Samuel Morse invites the territory. I know you do that. And so you had, telegraph lines are not out west yet, but the second part is you're absolutely right. Newspapers are out there, and parishes, well, you're saying parishes, which I always take as a Catholic term. Churches are very, very much part of this. Oh yeah, no, that second Great Awakening thing that I was talking about.
Even beyond the Catholic parish?
Oh, well beyond.
All the religious
Listen, the second,
houses of worship?
yes, absolutely. This is one of those things that, again, it's this moment in time. So it's every religion, it's every geographic area, it's every occupation. You know, lawyers, saloon keepers, blacksmiths, farmers, of course, you name it, every occupation. The prisoners of Sing Sing raise money for this contribution. The slave churches in Virginia take up a collection for this effort.
Because they've heard.
Yes, the Choctaw Indians, who were part of the Trail of Tears Indians, 16 years earlier, contribute $150 to the Irish as a result of this. And by the way, the Choctaw Ireland connection continues to this day. In 1995, Mary Robinson, who was the president of Ireland at the time, is invited to join the Choctaw Elder Council. She's the first woman that sits on that Elder Council because of the contributions that they make. And during this pandemic, this past pandemic, the Irish contribute to the Choctaw Nation and to the Navajo Nation here in the United States. So that connection happens, right? So, yeah, isn't it amazing? Yeah, I'm stunned by this. Yes, I'm still stunned by it. I wrote the book on it, and I'm stunned on it. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Aside from the Irish people who defected to fight in the war,
Yes.
did the country of Ireland ever provide any other support to Britain or the United States?
No. So did the country of Ireland provide other support to Britain and the United States outside of these people who essentially go rogue, is your question? No. All the way up to 1945, there are Nazis who have fled walking the streets of Dublin. This is a real bone of contention among a lot of the Irish people. Like I said, it starts in 40 and 41 when Churchill literally says, will you guys come and help us? Is there a way you can help us? And they say no. I'll go one step further. British ships that were fleeing Nazi U-boats were not allowed to seek refuge in places like Clare Island and some of these other places. There are British ships that went to the bottom because they could not seek refuge in Ireland. So it was, I told you, that World War II thing is very fascinating to me. But yeah.
As that lady mentioned, how are you getting the message across? Well, I have one question anyway. Can you tell us the style of your writing? Is it like a historical novel? And I'm thinking of Johnny Tremain. For years, I taught that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Is it kind of like that? Is it a story to it?
Yeah, yeah, I can answer your question. So the question is, how do I write? What's my style? Is it like a historical novel? This book, but this is kind of all my books. I won't call it a historical novel. I'll call it narrative nonfiction, right? Narrative history. So I told you, you will be reading this story and you'll be, I hope, turning the pages, having a tough time putting it down. I'm just saying, right? I'm telling you, that's how I do it. And so I've read a lot of history. There's a lot of bad history out there, right? A lot of dry, dusty history. When history is so dramatic, it has great characters, it's got great stories. So I try to convey that. I try to put you in the moment. I teach a lot of writing, either seminars or just working one-on-one with people who write, and I tell nonfiction writers, when you write nonfiction, you better use elements of fiction in your writing. And what do I mean by that? You better know when to break a scene so that the reader says, oh my God, I have to go to the next scene. You have to know not to write 40 pages without a section break. Not a good idea when a reader goes like this, at 10 o'clock at night. You don't want that. You have to have a section break, and you have to know when a chapter ends, and you have to know how to build characters, and you have to know how to do background. So you don't put 20 pages of background in a row. You release the background slowly, like piece by piece, in certain sections and things like that. There's a lot of those elements of writing, what I would call fiction writing, only because it's generally not done in history, that I try to inject into my history. And so that's one of the reasons why the primary sources are so important to me. Because when you write that way, you risk somebody saying, did you make anything up here? Did you, embellish? And so no. Your primary sources, I think, have to be better when you write in this way so that you can support it. So that's how I do it. Yeah. Oh, wait, and now I am getting the height side. So one more question? Yeah, sure. Oh yeah, wait a minute. Are you gonna be in the signing line later to buy a book?
I was just gonna ask you what you're working on now.
Okay. But what I'm gonna say is, if you're in the signing line, you can ask me a question. Can you do that? Are you gonna do that? Can you wait till out there and we can ask the question? Because I only got one more. Like Christy's back here. Yeah. All right. So your question is what?
What are you working on now?
What am I working on next? So listen, I can't quite tell you yet. I will tell you that it's book 8. I'm very excited about it. I'm well along on it. The writing's going pretty well. Still enough to do. My manuscript is due November 1st, if you guys need to know that, by contract. So I think it'll be, I think May and June will be pivotal months for the writing, just because I want to be in a certain spot by the end of June, and then the manuscript's due November 1st, but then I back up, right? I have 3 pre-readers, including my lovely wife, who's one of them, who reads the manuscript, so I like to give my readers a month or so, and then I need 2 weeks to fix their stuff. So November 1st is not a long way away. Okay, so let me answer that. Let me finish that up with this. If you would like to, I have a sheet out here that you just put your email address down, and you can join my mailing list. I do about 3 or 4 mailings a year. I don't spam you. I had one woman say to me, listen, I signed up for Williams-Sonoma and I get something every day from them. Is that going to be you? It is not going to be me. It is not going to be me. I don't have time. I just don't have time to do it. So I do 3 or 4 a year. So if you'd like to be on that list, you will be among the first several thousand people who know what the book's about. Yeah. So, all right, you guys. Thank you very much.